I have been waiting very patiently to create part 3 of this deep dive into Halo Infinite, because part 3 is where we move away from the missions featured in its campaign, and I get to talk about its open world. This video on the whole is going to be perhaps a little less analytical than you may have become accustomed to compared to my previous videos, but hopefully by the end of it you'll understand better why I think Halo Infinite's open world is, to be frank, pretty rubbish. So let's get right into it. I'm sure many of you remember some of developer 343 Industries' comments leading up to the release of Halo Infinite. They spoke of the game being a love letter to the series and referenced multiple missions from Combat Evolved as inspiration, in particular the game's second mission Halo and its fourth mission, the Silent Cartographer. In terms of the game's visual style, it's fair to say that they did nail it to at least some degree. I'm not overly enamoured with the overall quality of Halo Infinite's graphics. I'd struggle to describe them as anything other than serviceable, but putting them to one side, I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that Zeta Halo doesn't invoke memories of the Halo games of old, in particular Halo Combat Evolved. And that doesn't just apply to the open world itself, but also to the Forerunner interiors as well, which I genuinely believe to be outstanding in terms of visual direction. I remember vividly playing the mission Halo for the first time more than 20 years ago and being blown away by the scope of what I was experiencing. The sweeping green fields, the waterfalls, the ring itself disappearing into the sky, it was quite unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. PC gamers at the time wrote off Combat Evolved as being a console first-person shooter which catered to a more casual market and did little that hadn't already been done compared to games available on computers. And while I must confess that at the time I agreed with them to a certain extent, in retrospect I think that conclusion is wholly incorrect. Nowadays, I don't believe there was any game available on PC back in 2001 that did what Halo Combat Evolved did to anywhere near the same level of quality. Its combination of a robust sandbox, gameplay innovations, and the aforementioned environments which felt alien not just in their makeup but in their expansiveness was truly unrivaled. At surface level, there's no doubt in my mind that Zeta Halo is extremely close to what 13-year-old Ben would have imagined an open world version of that same mission to look like back in 2001. It is for all intents and purposes Halo, but on a spectacular new scale. After having the most cursory glances at Halo Infinite's open world then, your reaction might be, so far so good, it certainly looks the part. But when you begin to scratch away even a little at the game's nostalgic coat of paint, it quickly becomes apparent that what's underneath is little more than a pale imitation of what's come before. It would be rather kind, I think, to describe Halo Infinite's open world as anything other than bland. The adherence to a visual style invoking your favourite missions of old may at first trick you into thinking it's just as exciting an experience as exploring Installation 04 was the first time you got your hands on Bungie's magnum opus, but in reality it's little more than a mirage, something you desperately hope will manifest, but which begins to seem increasingly out of reach. The short rundown the weapon gives you of everything available to do on the map may at first be cause for excitement, but in little time you'll realise the gigantic map she presents you with and the optional content available on Zeta Halo serve only as an accompaniment to the mirage itself. After witnessing it, you may for just a moment or two believe that maybe, just maybe, the promise of a new dawn for the series is not a mirage, but something real, something attainable. For me, the illusion was shattered after about an hour or so. My first journey out into the wilds of Zeta Halo was an eventful one. I laid waste to a banished base, I rescued a squad of Marines, and I found the odd Spartan core lying around, and I enjoyed every minute of it. If the open world's visual style is what gets its hooks into you first, then Infinite's gameplay will likely do similar not too long after as you take on these initially promising challenges. From a gameplay perspective, the familiar Halo sandbox setup accompanied by the new utility the grappling hook offers is extremely impressive. Combined with more space than ever to flex your sci-fi military muscles in, for a short while it does feel like the series may finally be reinvigorated. The issue is that once that first hour or so is over, you'll quickly realise that that very same gameplay is expected to do pretty much all of the heavy lifting. Now granted, it never buckles too much under the intense pressure of everything else it's forced to elevate, but in all honesty, it should never have got to that point in the first place. The more you explore Zeta Halo, the more you clear banished bases, rescue Marines, kill high-value targets and the like, the more you'll begin to realise that it is, at its core, an open world which largely follows what I'd describe as the Ubisoft blueprint. I was incredibly disappointed when I found this to be the case, although I think it's fair to say that I may have perhaps had loftier expectations than I should have done. Due to the trailers which dropped as the game's release date edged ever closer, I became quietly optimistic about Infinite. I thought it might just turn out alright. And that quiet optimism only increased when I watched a few videos YouTube continually recommended to me, which featured people I'm not going to name playing the first few hours of the campaign. I chose to watch a few by content creators who looked like they were fans of Halo in particular, as I thought they'd have a more well-rounded view of what made Halo Halo, and what I heard sounded great. There were claims made that there was nothing to worry about in terms of Infinite being repetitive, and that the game was nothing like Far Cry or similar open-world titles, and indeed I read similar in articles featured in numerous publications as well. I think we can all now safely say that the open world is exactly like Far Cry, if not lacking in comparison, and I've absolutely no idea how anyone could have ever claimed otherwise. My feed at the moment is clogged full of videos from these same people talking about how terrible the single player is, in direct contradiction to their earlier comments as they continue to pander to the fans as best they can. The flip-flopping is somewhat nauseating, to say the least. Whether you paid attention to all the glowing pre-release hyperbole or not, as I said, it probably won't take you longer than an hour or so to realise what Halo Infinite's open world truly is. It is a template, it is designed by numbers, a fairly shallow copy of other developers' work by those who have been doing it longer and are therefore better at doing it. Zeta Halo's structure is simple enough to understand. Due to the damage the ring sustained prior to the events of the game, the section of it you explore has been split into different segments, which gradually unlock as you make your way through Infinite's campaign missions. Each features multiple FOB bases you can capture, which essentially act as respawn points where you can stock up on weapons or call in new vehicles, and you can even pick up nearby marines if you fancy some extra firepower. Once you're all stocked up, you can then traverse the world at your leisure, taking on campaign missions if you fancy a dose of story, or engaging in the optional side content. Doing either will earn you valor points, which unlock bigger and better weapons and vehicles, helping you become an even more finely honed instrument of death, and soon enough you'll be armed to the teeth and be able to cut through banished forces like a hot knife through aliens. Unfortunately, the Valor system and the Spartan cores, which allow you to upgrade your equipment, are about as dynamic as the overarching systems in the game ever get, and this is a huge problem, as it means Infinite is left without an open world unique selling point. What exactly do I mean by an open world unique selling point? Well, I'm of the view that no game has truly managed to create an open world that I'd describe as truly top tier. There are several titles which come close, however, a few of which I quickly want to touch on. The Witcher 3 does open world storytelling better than any other game on the market. The way developer CD Projekt Red uses side quests to world build is extraordinary, and the repercussions of your choices during them will often be felt long after a quest has reached its conclusion. Zelda Breath of the Wild stands above many other similar games of its ilk due to its interactivity, with players given an incredible amount of choice in how they interact with the world and take on enemies. And finally, to highlight a more recent release, From Software took things back to basics, so to speak, with Elden Ring, building an open world that ignored many of the design tropes so prevalent in other games, in the process creating one which was a joy to explore. There's no doubt that the games I've just listed are groundbreaking, but they all have different strengths and indeed weaknesses, and this is what makes Zeta Halo such a disappointment to me. At present, I don't think every single part of an open world needs to be breathtakingly excellent in order for the game it's a part of to be lauded by critics and fans alike. It just needs to do one or two things really well, and be at minimum competent in other areas, like the examples I just spoke of. It could be argued that Infinite comes close. The grappling hook and its gameplay in general are top notch, and it feels wonderful to play. There are few open world games which match it in terms of sheer playability. However, for me that's not quite enough, and 343 Industries really needed to take things one step further than they have. While the grappling hook is an exciting new addition, Halo's gameplay has always been fantastic. In fact, I'd say it's arguably been the most consistently solid part of the franchise for years. But it wasn't the gameplay in isolation that made Halo titles great, but rather it combined with a wealth of interesting scenarios across each and every game. That perfectly balanced mix of sandbox gameplay and curated encounter design simply isn't present in Halo Infinite. Each banished base, each high-value target, and the UNSC rescue missions are usually none too different from the last, save for the layout of some buildings being changed or a different group of enemies patrolling the immediate area. There are no set pieces during any of these missions, nor does anything you have to do have a real and lasting effect beyond your valor counter increasing. You do the same things for the second, third, or 10th time, then head to the map screen to figure out which generic activity to take on next. What I find it interesting to think about is that I'm not sure I'd have as much of an issue as I do with Zeta Halo's repetitive side content if the game's campaign didn't also suffer from the same problem. By its halfway point, much of it begins to blur into one, and you'll realise, if you hadn't already, that it's a far cry from anything we've seen in previous, more linear entries. It lacks variety and imagination, and reuses content to a ridiculous extent. I struggle with Halo Combat Evolved and 2 at times due to their reused content, but neither of them are anywhere close to being as bad as Infinite is in this regard. If the campaign was even up to the standards of 4 or 5, let alone Bungie's titles, then the lack of engaging content in the open world I don't think would be half as noticeable. Of course, it wouldn't improve the quality of that content at all, but I believe it would at least cause less player fatigue than it does. Exploring Zeta Halo would be more of a welcome distraction. In between high-octane, set-piece driven, heavily directed campaign missions, you could unwind with some relative tranquility and the opportunity to take things at your own pace. As it stands, because the campaign and the side content are so repetitive, it never begins to feel like you're doing anything more than simply going through the motions. You complete a repetitive campaign mission, then you do some repetitive side content, and so on and so forth. To put it bluntly, they in no way complement each other, and instead actively detract from one another. There are 3 things that I think need to improve if the open world format is something 343 Industries wishes to continue with moving forward, and it's really important these changes are made as it is ridiculously underwhelming at present. The first, surprise surprise, is the world's variety. A fair few people have said that only having one biome, namely Halo Combat Evolved Mission Halo's green fields and mountains, is disappointing, and that the lack of areas featuring snow, deserts and the like is a big problem. While increased environmental variety would definitely be no bad thing, I do believe that the world of Infinite as it stands should be more than sufficient. A mix of backdrops would make for a more interesting visual experience, there's no doubt about that, but I prefer that 343 spent more time thinking about how the current side content could be made more varied, and what could be added to expand on the game's current repertoire. Designing side content in an open world is a tricky proposition, especially in a shooter, as you never really know where any given player will approach the action from, nor what loadout they'll be equipped with when they do. They might come straight through the front door driving a Scorpion, or they will perhaps instead take the sneaky approach and infiltrate the area from the rear with a sniper rifle. Compare that to previous more directed Halo titles, where Bungie or 343 would always have a pretty good idea of where you'd be approaching from and what loadouts you might have. Take for example the early stages of Combat Evolved mission Truth and Reconciliation. Bungie knew you'd be approaching each area using a certain path, and so were able to set up enemies and the area itself to cater to that approach. There's plenty of space between you and the enemy, the Covenant forces are spread out to make it easier to remain undetected, and they're able to scale up each subsequent area in complexity as a way of increasing the difficulty as you progress. It works beautifully. This approach is of course going to be far harder to execute during open world encounters, but I'd like to see 343 really stretch their creative muscles to make it happen. One example off the top of my head would be using caves to connect multiple larger areas, even if you can approach the first from any angle. That way, at least some of the time, they'd know where you were coming from, and as such, could throw in the odd scripted moment when they knew you were most likely to see it. Another would be to increase the number of smaller, possibly random scripted moments which occur during optional content. The most we get at the moment is a dropship or 2 turning up, but what about a scarab joining the fray? Or perhaps a pelican arriving to rescue marines mid-battle? Or how about 1 or 2 of the high-value targets taking to vehicles to escape once they know you're in the vicinity? Those aren't the most imaginative examples, I know, but the open world is sorely lacking in memorable moments as it stands, and I think there's much which could be done to make them far more varied. Second, Halo Infinite desperately needs co-op. In fact, I'd say that on the whole, it feels like the game was built for it, with the FOBs being a perfect meeting point where you and your squad can kit up before hitting the road. With somewhere between 2 and 4 Spartans working together against an increased number of enemies to account for them, suddenly a lot of the side content I think would become far more entertaining. Why it wasn't included to begin with is anybody's guess, and unfortunately it is likely down to the project as a whole being somewhat mismanaged, but there's still hope. Get co-op into Infinite or whatever follows next, and the game will improve drastically as a result. The fantastic gameplay, the new attacking options offered by the grappling hook, and the huge environments to mess about in honestly make the game feel tailor-made for it. My final improvement is probably just a pipe dream based on the quality of what we already have, but I'd love to see the open world become much more dynamic outside the included side content. When talking about the game with a few people who watched my videos prior to Infinite's release, I mentioned how I'd love to see areas of the map get taken over by the flood, with larger areas becoming infested depending on how much action you took against them. Obviously, the flood aren't in the game, so this particular example could never have happened, but I don't think smaller changes to the map are completely outside the realm of possibility. Perhaps a pelican crashes somewhere ahead of you, it doesn't come up on your map, but you're free to investigate as you see fit. Leave it too long and the banished get there first, arrive there quickly and you may be able to rescue any survivors. Skirmishes of anything more than a few marines and banished are practically non-existent unless you make it happen, and again it's something that would really make the world come alive. Imagine coming across multiple warthogs driving across an area towards a squad of brute choppers, or marines being dropped in by pelican to take out a brute chieftain. It would really help keep things interesting. Although, that being said, a lot of work would need to be done on the marine AI, as I currently remain unconvinced that their brains aren't made out of jelly. So there we have it, those are the big things which sprung to my mind when I sat down to think about Halo Infinite's open world. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think Zeta Halo is the best open world ever and I'm chatting absolute nonsense? Do let me know. Also, if you have your own ideas for how you'd improve it, I'd love to hear those too. And of course, thanks for watching, boys, girls and Spartans. If you enjoyed the video, do consider liking and subscribing as it really helps the channel, and hopefully I'll catch you all again soon.